read this, and you have to pretend that John Finucane is here. My introduction is by way of a letter I wrote to Mr. Pearce, but never sent, so I thought I would read it to him today. It's personal. Dear Joseph, this will be your 9th time coming to Rochester to speak at our conference. Lou and I have become rather concerned for you and would like to discuss certain instances that have occurred over the years that leave us wondering why you come back. Although we enjoy your company. Your first year as a speaker found you scrambling about looking for your lost notes as you were being introduced. It was suspected but never proven that another of our regular speakers, who shall remain nameless, in a fit of jealousy, hid the notes under your chair. From memory, you gave an excellent talk on J.R.R. Tolkien. This will be a different talk this year, right? When you returned 2 years later, you realized that you had left your suit coat in your car at the airport in Florida. After some local scouting for a replacement for the coat, we benefited by the great generosity and correct size of Scott Whitcomb, who wishes to remain nameless. Problem solved. Do I need to remind you of the time when, after returning to your home from the conference, you asked us to look for cufflinks you left on a shelf in our house? Our English setter, who shall remain nameless, was rightly suspected of swallowing them. We dug around for them in the most likely places of where they might have dropped, promising to return them if found. You thanked us warmly, but decided it was time to give up wearing cufflinks. Surely you haven't forgotten the year you were introduced by our genuine from County Kerry Irishman, who shall remain nameless, and who nearly stole the show. He helpfully reminded us of those days when, as a skinhead, you would visit the Irish to lay hands on them. He's a forgiving fellow after a bit and gave you the most memorable introduction we've ever had. Remember the time? No, actually, you probably don't. Does the little red sports car Dale rented stir up any feelings? After painfully squeezing yourself into the tiny excuse for a back seat, you received a blow to the head as the trunk was slammed down by someone who shall remain nameless, and part of the car roof landed on top of you. Sorry we were not more sympathetic to your pain, but we were blinded by tears and doubled over with laughter. Are you okay? You've had a touching poem read to you about the friendship between a Kerry Irishman and a rabble-rousing Englishman, you. By the way, he has more in common with you than was imagined. I have it on good authority by someone who shall remain nameless, that there is a history of rebellion and rowdiness in this Irish blackguard's past. As a little lad in the old country, he had to be tied to a tree by his babysitter to keep him under control. Another reformed rebel, although in his mild-mannered way, he has become a bit of a skinhead himself over the years. More than once, you've been accused from this podium by a husband who shall remain nameless of not possibly being the author of your many books. You've been criticized for having an unintelligible accent. You've turned the cafeteria into a pool hall. And you've been bitten by our cat, who shall remain nameless. Again and again you return despite the good, the bad, and the painful. And although you are under suspicion at the Rochester airport for being the only person who gets off the plane smiling, we are happy and relieved to welcome you back, Joseph Pearce.
You know the worst thing about coming to the Rochester Conference? What do I do with my notes? The worst thing is that I'm always always being upstaged by the person who introduces me. Always feel like I've got a hard act to follow, and I'm the first person today. There's something wrong here. Let me apologise to everybody for the fact that I do keep coming back every year. It's a bad habit I have, and one that, in spite of the best efforts of Lou and Jeanne to get me to drop, I keep coming back. So it's good to be back. It's actually my wife knows that this is fun, and her last words to me before I left yesterday morning was just have fun, because she knows that this is a conference which is just great fun. It's great fun because of the people who are here. So it's good to be back, and that's why I keep coming back in spite of the trials and tribulations of life at the Horvaths. And their cat. I think the cat didn't actually bite me, the cat clawed me. But anyway, so I've got memories of the... Okay, on to the topic under discussion. It was mentioned that I did give a talk on the Lord of the Rings. Was it the first time I came? Yes. Okay, how many people were here 10 years ago? Okay. How many people remember what I spoke about 10 years ago? Yeah. Well, yes, these 2 or 3 people with their hands up. Well, I am actually not going to give the same talk again 10 years ago, although it didn't seem to be matter if I did, because the topic 10 years ago was the Lord of the Rings, and the reason was that the Peter Jackson movies had only just been released a year or 2 earlier. But now, of course, we have the Hobbit movies out, so the talk I'm going to give this evening actually is on Tolkien, Chesterton, Tolkien, and the Hobbit, as opposed to the Lord of the Rings. So the main focus is going to be the Hobbit, although there'll be a bit of overlap with the Lord of the Rings. Let me just, I'm also taking a chance here because I forgot to bring my watch with me, so my cell phone is on. And it's normally completely safe because no one knows my cell phone number. But the last time I did this was at a conference somewhere out in the Midwest, and my wife decided to phone me in the middle of my talk, even though she knew I was getting the talk. I don't understand that. Maybe just to... anyway, so if it goes off, I'm taking the chance. So I'm going to see how long I've been speaking for. Okay. So, Chesterton, Tolkien, and the Hobbit. First of all, I just want to say a few things about Chesterton's influence on Tolkien. Unfortunately, of course, The Hobbit was published 1 year after Chesterton died, so we didn't have the wonderful experience of knowing how the 2 men would have got on if their lives had actually overlapped in a way in which that Chesterton knew of Tolkien. But of course, Tolkien very much knew of Chesterton. He was received into the church in 1900, Tolkien, after his mother had converted, so he was a child convert, and grew up reading the works of Chesterton and Belloc. I mean, this is obvious from some of Tolkien's letters. It's also obvious from many things that Tolkien wrote, but it became more obvious recently because Christopher Tolkien, Tolkien's son, put some of Tolkien's personal library up for sale, and there were a large number of Belloc and Chesterton titles in Tolkien's own book collection. We see, for instance, the philosophy that underpins The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is encapsulated in a lecture that's published subsequently as an essay by Tolkien on fairy stories. And in that famous lecture, he references Chestertonian fantasy as being a major way of accessing the truth to be found in story. And in fact, much on fairy stories is quite clearly influenced by Chesterton's chapter in Orthodoxy, The Ethics of Elfland. So I think what we see, I mean, again, we won't know, perhaps it's one of the things we find out if we get to the blessed realm after death, but I think that Chesterton would have loved Tolkien, and I think the reason that Chesterton would have loved Tolkien, apart from the fact that Tolkien's works are profoundly Catholic, is that he did really encapsulate Elfland and the ethics of Elfland in a way that Chesterton was pointing towards in Orthodoxy. And I think few people would dispute that in The Lord of the Rings, the ethics of Elfland are brought to fruition in something which we can describe without any exaggeration as one of the great literary masterpieces of all time. Okay, so my first book on Tolkien was written in 1997 or 1998, and it was in response to some opinion polls in England. I did mention this in my first talk, so the 5 people that remember what I said, you can go to sleep for a few minutes. But I was motivated, or perhaps infuriated enough to be provoked into writing my book on Tolkien by the dismissive response of the critics to the emergence of The Lord of the Rings as the greatest work of the 20th century in several opinion polls in England. The first one was conducted jointly by Channel 4 Television, one of the national TV networks in the UK, jointly with Waterstones, who are sort of the Barnes and Noble of the UK, big book-selling chain. And in second place in that greatest work of the 20th century was 1984 by George Orwell, but getting 50% more votes. In other words, a runaway winner was The Lord of the Rings. The subsequent opinion polls ratified that. And the response to the critics was such that, some of my favourites was one critic merely stated, this just shows the folly of teaching people to read. Nothing like an unbiased judgment. And my favourite one was the attitude of Germaine Greer. Who here has heard of Germaine Greer? See, I can actually test the intelligence of an audience by the response to that. It means that you've read too many bad books. Because Germaine Greer, for those of you who don't know who she is, shot to fame in 1970 as the author of a book called The Female Eunuch, which is one of the classic works, if that's the right way of putting it, of the women's liberation movement. And she's been an arch feminist ever since. She wrote a really silly book about Shakespeare fairly recently, basically implying that that Mrs. Shakespeare was the most important influence in the writing of the books. But her words I've remembered word for word. She said, when on discovering that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings had won the greatest book of the 20th century, ever since my arrival in Cambridge in 1964, to be confronted by a tribe of full-grown women wearing puffed sleeves, clutching teddy bears, and babbling on excitedly about the doings of hobbits, it's been my worst nightmare that The Lord of the Rings should emerge as the greatest work of the 20th century. The nightmare has become reality. Now, there's a part of my personality that's not going to get me to heaven. My wife says to me, when I laugh at certain jokes and certain things, she says, "You won't be going to heaven for as long as you find that funny." But there's a part of me that will get me to purgatory, at least I hope, that thinks it was worth Tolkien writing The Lord of the Rings just to make Germaine Greer's nightmares come true. And everything else is a bonus. But of course, what Tolkien said of The Lord of the Rings, he said, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. And it is, of course, let's emphasize the word, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. And yet, as Chesterton said, it doesn't matter how much he made the point of a story stick out like a spike, the critics will go and impale themselves carefully on something else. And actually on Thursday, 2 days ago, I was in the studio doing something for BBC Radio 4, BBC National Radio in England, on the Tolkien's theology. And I was in a debate with an Anglican priestess My wife says to me she's not a priestess because she's not a priest. But anyway, that's enough of ecumenism for one talk. But an Anglican priestess and a pagan. The pagan was arguing for the Lord of the Rings being a pagan work, and the Anglican was arguing for it being sort of a nice work. And what became very clear as the debate went on is that the Anglican and the pagan were ganging up on me, which I took to be very gratifying. And when I actually mentioned about paganism, I said, yes, I don't think Tolkien had any problem with paganism per se, but I think that he distinguished, as did C.S. Lewis, between true paganism, which is can be likened to a virgin who awaits the coming of the bridegroom, Christ. Whereas the so-called pseudo-paganism of so-called post-Christianity is not like a virgin awaiting the coming of the bridegroom, but a divorcee who's deserted the bridegroom. And the pagan said that sort of thing is unacceptable in a multi-faith community. We cannot have that sort of discussion, that sort of talk in a multi-faith community. And I didn't say it, but I thought it, well, that's exactly what J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis believed. So here we are on the BBC having a debate about Tolkien's theology when Tolkien's theology is now unacceptable and cannot be discussed. But anyway, I kept emphasizing throughout the hour of the show Tolkien's own words that The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, and giving other evidence. But I want to now move on to The Hobbit. And what Tolkien says about so-called fantasy is that it's not escapist in the sense that Germaine Greer and company think. Because what it does is hold up, these are Tolkien's words from his essay on fairy stories. Fairy stories hold up a mirror to man. A mirror to man. In other words, they show us ourselves. And if something is showing us ourselves, it's pretty realistic. But the one thing we need to understand, of course, about Tolkien, insofar as he's a Catholic, is what did Tolkien understand that man was? Because for Tolkien, man is not Homo sapien, but Homo viator. He's man on a journey. But all of us are here, we're placed here to go on a quest. The quest is to get to heaven. It's our only purpose in life is to get to heaven. And getting to heaven is not easy because life itself is an adventure and it's full of monsters and demons and dragons and love and hatred and virtue and vice. And we have to struggle on that path through life so that at the end of the journey we achieve the journey's purpose. We succeed in the quest of getting to Jesus Christ. That's the purpose of everybody's life. We're Homo viator. So when we understand that, we see Bilbo's journey in The Hobbit as a mirror of our journey. It's a rite of passage from ignorance to wisdom and from sin to virtue. It's a mystical meditation on divine providence and the relationship between grace and free will. Also, The Hobbit, on the deepest level, and I'm going to go into more detail on this, is a moral commentary on Scripture, on the Gospel, Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So let's now follow the story a little bit. And let me ask, how many people here have read The Hobbit? Okay. So, at the beginning of the story, Bilbo does not want to go on an adventure. He's got all of his creature comforts. He's got his nice hobbit hole. He's got good food and good drink in the pantry. He's got all of his crockery and cutlery, all of his furniture, everything a good hobbit could want is within reach. Why on earth would he want to go on a journey, on an adventure? And Gandalf tries to persuade him that it would be very profitable for him if he survives. That was a bit of a problem in persuading him to leave. But of course, in the end, Bilbo does decide to go, and he has to decide to go. In other words, he can't be pushed out of the door. Gandalf is not going to drag him out of his hobbit hole. The dwarves are not going to kick him across the threshold. He has to, of his own free will, of his own volition, choose to go on the adventure. So, admittedly, with great reluctance, he chooses to go. And then throughout the story we have, on many occasions, the recurrence of the word luck. And luck, actually I gave this talk and I asked someone, I have no idea, so I'm not enough of a nerd to actually go through The Hobbit and count the number of times that the word luck appears in The Hobbit. Thankfully in the audience there was a nerd who went and did it all, and you can see here, this is the chapter number, the page number, the paragraph number, the line number, the speaker of the word, and the term used. Luckily, luck, luckily, lucky, 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 luck, luck, lucky, lucky, lucky. And apparently the luck is mentioned in The Hobbit at least 36 times. This is not an exhaustive list, but we tried to find as much as we could. I won't give you the name of the nerd, as in the immortal words of Jeanne Horvath, he shall remain nameless. But the word luck is mentioned over and over again, but the point is, of course, luck is not mere or pure chance. At the end of The Hobbit, or towards the end of the book, Gandalf says explicitly to Bilbo as they're heading home after the success of the quest against the dragon, you don't think all of this was achieved by mere luck, do you? So if we hadn't got the point already, Tolkien makes sure we get it, because Gandalf gives it to us. But I'll give you an example of what luck is in The Hobbit. It's really the way that we all in our lives are called to cooperate with grace through our own free will. And that insofar as we cooperate with grace through our own free will, providence will provide, will be looked after. Insofar as we don't, we're in big trouble. So I'll give you an example, the riddling game. And one of the most famous scenes in The Hobbit is, of course, when Bilbo and Gollum are having their riddling game, and it's a high-stakes riddling game. The loser gets eaten. Even in Las Vegas, there's no high stakes of that sort. It's not strictly true, of course. I don't think that Bilbo is interested in eating Gollum, should he win. He just wants to be shown the way out. But if Bilbo loses, he gets eaten, so it's high stakes. He's obviously nervous. Gollum asks him a riddle. Bilbo doesn't know the answer. He's panicking. And it's clear at this stage that Gollum would have won if he just behaved in a virtuous manner, showed an element of patience and fairness and charity, and let Bilbo stammer for another minute or so. He wouldn't be able to find the answer, and Gollum would have his lunch. But Gollum, not being a creature of virtue, is impatient. So he doesn't give Bilbo sufficient time to think. As soon as he senses that Bilbo's stuttering and stumbling for an answer, he gets into the water and starts to advance on Bilbo. And the consequence of that action is that he scares a fish. And a fish jumps out of the water and lands in Bilbo's lap. That's lucky. Because the answer to the riddle was fish. And of course, given that hint, it's all that Bilbo needed, he shouts, fish! Now that's lucky, but the luck, the good fortune, is connected to Gollum's vice. It's Gollum's bad choice that leads to the chain of events, the scaring of the fish, leaping into Bilbo's lap. And again, later on, same competition. Bilbo is floundering. That was a sort of pun, I suppose. with another answer. And he doesn't know the answer. And again, Gollum, in his impatience, advances on Bilbo. Bilbo panics. And what Bilbo wants to say is, give me more time, I need more time. But in his fear and his panic, his palate's all dried up, and all he can blurt out is, time! Which is the answer to the riddle. And again, great fortune, but it's connected to Gollum's bad actions. So throughout The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, virtue has good consequences. Evil, vice, has bad consequences. Say in The Lord of the Rings, Theoden says, oft evil will, evil mars. Oft evil will, evil mars. And to put it the other way, 3 pages later, 3 or 4 pages later, again, when Tolkien wants us to get a point, he does actually hammer it home. So having had Theoden said it there, 3 or 4 pages later, Gandalf says, often does evil hurt itself. Evil is self-destructive. Okay, another aspect of Tolkien's Catholicism that comes out in The Hobbit is the difference between wisdom and cleverness. You know, one of the signs of the arrogance of the Enlightenment is the fact that we called ourselves Homo sapiens. Of course, sapiens is from the Latin for wisdom, wise. Because wisdom's something we're not born with. Wisdom's something that some of us might acquire throughout life, and many of us don't. So we're not Homo sapiens. What they really meant to say was that we are naked apes. We're very clever. We're smarter than the monkeys. The Enlightenment was making the big mistake of not making a distinction between wisdom and cleverness. Well, Tolkien does not make that mistake. In The Hobbit, turn to page 31 of a book that you all need to buy out there. And this is from The Hobbit. We're told that goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. And they make no beautiful things, but many clever ones. It's not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days and those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. So here we see Tolkien in The Hobbit showing us orcs are clever. But orcs are damn clever. And they're damned because of it. Because cleverness in the absence of wisdom is not just dangerous, it leads to evil. Another aspect of The Lord of the Rings. Actually, let me read one other thing from here, because the thing about that as well, notice this. We're told that the goblins or orcs are cruel and wicked. They don't make beautiful things, but many clever ones. But then the story leaps out from the story. Not unlikely they invented some of the machines in our world that kills loads of people. So all of a sudden Tolkien is saying, well, you know, goblins and orcs aren't only to be found in stories about Middle Earth from several thousand years ago. They might be living next door to you. We have orcs as neighbours. The narrative leaps out of the story into our midst, into our presence. We have them as neighbours. And then, to illustrate the point, Tolkien wrote a letter towards the end of the Second World War. I don't know if you know, we're having a talk on Solzhenitsyn later, which I'm excited about. But Stalin basically told the Red Army that they had carte blanche to kill any German men they found and to rape any German women. In consequence, of course, there were millions of German-speaking people in East Prussia that were fleeing ahead of the Red Army, knowing what awaited them if they didn't stay ahead of them. And this is that scenario as mentioned by Tolkien in the letter. The appalling destruction and misery of this war mount hourly. Yet people gloat to hear of the endless lines, 40 miles long, of miserable refugees, women and children pouring west, dying on the way. There seem no bowels of mercy or compassion, no imagination left in this dark, diabolical hour. We were supposed to have reached a stage of civilization in which it might still be necessary to execute a criminal, but not to gloat or to hang his wife and child by him while the orc crowd hooted. Well, the First War of the Machines seems to be drawing to its final inconclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone the poorer, many bereaved or maimed, and millions dead, and only one thing triumphant: the machines. As the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, the machines are going to be enormously more powerful. What's their next move? The orc crowd hooted. As Tolkien's writing The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, he sees orcs. We are all capable of becoming orcs. Because the journey through life is a journey for all of us. And we're either going to make the ascent towards God by giving our assent to Him, or we are basically going to Gollumize ourselves and become less and less who we're supposed to be, and more hideous parody, or parable for that matter, of who we are meant to be. Okay, there are other aspects of The Hobbit I want to talk about that show Tolkien's Catholicism. There's the return of the king. Now, of course, in The Lord of the Rings, the return of the king is a huge part of the story, but it's also a significant part of The Hobbit. Thorin Oakenshield is the true king, and it's prophesied that the return of the true king will herald the defeat of the dragon. And for Tolkien, of course, in Lord of the Rings, of course, it's Aragorn is the true king. And for Tolkien, as a Catholic Englishman, we have references to King Arthur, the once and future king who will return to save England from her enemies. We also have, very importantly, the Jacobites, the true kings of England who were forced into exile by the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, when a usurper, William of Orange, was placed on the throne, and the true king, James II, forced into exile. So for English Catholics and for Scots, we await the return of the true king, which is why in The Lord of the Rings, Minas Tirith has stewards who are merely keeping the throne warm until the true king returns. Queen Elizabeth II is a steward keeping the throne of England warm until the return of the true king. And of course, and ultimately, the return of the king always is related to the return of the king, Christ. Christ the King's return as promised and prophesied. So we see the return of the king, both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The other thing we see in both works is the presence of God's providence in the darkest moments of our lives and the darkest moments of our culture. We always, and John Henry Newman said that in every generation, Christians always believe that their generation is the worst. And I just read a little passage of a letter from 1945. Things are certainly not as bad in Germany or Russia, for that matter, now as they were in 1945. So yes, we live in a dark world, a land of shadows. But as Samwise Gamgee says in The Lord of the Rings, above all shadows rides the sun. And Christians know that. And there's no reason for a Christian to become despondent, and still less reason for a Christian to despair. Despair, remember, is a grievous sin, a sin of pride, where we lose all hope in God. But look at various aspects in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In The Hobbit, they're trying to find their way into the underground cavern where Smaug is to get to the treasure. And they're told that there's a way in, they can't find it, they search everywhere. All human, all hobbit, all dwarf power is brought to bear on trying to find the door, the way in. But then at a certain moment, as prophesied, as told earlier in the story, the final ray of the sun, as it's about to set, points a finger at the keyhole, at the door. So it's above all shadows rides the sun. It's the light of providence itself that points the way. Human power by itself does not overcome evil. We have to have the assistance of supernatural grace. We see it again with Smaug, the dragon. In his pride, he turns over to show Bilbo his impregnable armor. This armor cannot be destroyed by anybody. Smaug is indestructible. But in his pride and arrogance, as he rolls over and shows himself in his armor, his resplendent armor to Bilbo, Bilbo notices there's a little hole in the armor above Smaug's heart. And of course, the symbolism there is significant. A black hole above the heart. And as Smaug swoops in to make his final attack on Lakeland, Bard the Bowman's got one arrow left. It seems to be hopeless. But as Smaug turns, the ray of the moon, which of course is just a reflection of the light of the sun, sparkles up the whole of Smaug's armour, all of his pride, his pomp. But there's one black hole above the heart. Bard the Bowman aims for that black hole and kills the dragon. And my favourite example of divine providence being shown in light is at the crossroads in The Lord of the Rings, where Frodo and Sam come across a statue of a king. This statue of a king symbolises civilization, symbolises the culture of virtue. But the statue had been decapitated. The head had been chopped off of the statue, and the statue itself was covered in orcish graffiti. Now, none of us want to read orcish graffiti. I hate to think what orcs write. But this is symbolic of the destruction of culture. All that's good has been desecrated and destroyed. Perhaps there's no hope. The symbol has been broken. The king's not only lost his crown, he's been decapitated, lost his head. And in this darkest moment, it's the end of the day, a solitary beam of sunlight, the setting sun, comes down and illuminates the head of the king that had been rolled several yards away from the statue. If you like, there's a halo of light now around the king's head, and they see through that halo of light that a plant, stone crop with beautiful golden flowers, a climbing plant, had crawled along the ground, along the grass, and wound itself around the head of the king with gold flowers. And Frodo says, "See, Sam, the king has a crown again. They cannot conquer forever." And here you see creation the sun, the flowers, uniting with man's subcreation, civilization, the statue, through the power of God, through the power of grace, to show that above all shadows rides the sun. All right, as we get towards the end here, we can't talk about the Hobbit without talking about the dragon. Well, in defining dragons, we have to begin by knowing what dragons are not. Dragons are not merely dinosaurs. Dragons are not just big with sharp teeth. They're not like a Tyrannosaurus Rex or a tiger that we're scared of, because if we found one in the room with us, we'd probably be killed by it. Dragons are much worse than that. Dragons are not just big and powerful and deadly. Dragons are demonic and evil. Which is why we're told in The Hobbit that dragons like to devour maidens. Not people, not even women, but maidens. Because their appetite is not for the destruction of flesh, but for the destruction of souls. It's about the destruction of innocence, of purity. The devouring is a deflowering. Dragons are demonic. The dragon's sickness is that the thing possessed possesses the possessor. Let's say that again. The thing possessed possesses the possessor. We become possessed by our possessions, addicted to our sin. Or, as Christ says, where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. So having said that, and this of course is the most important lesson that the Hobbit teaches, and the Lord of the Rings, the ring in the Lord of the Rings serves the same purpose as the dragon sickness does in the Hobbit. That the thing possessed possesses the possessor. But let me ask here, to have an intelligent audience, right, the dragon obviously suffers from the dragon sickness. He's a slave to his possessions. He owns more possessions than he could possibly use. He doesn't use any of them. And yet he daren't leave the cave in case somebody comes and steals a trinket of the tens of thousands of pieces of treasure he's got. Bilbo takes one, and Smaug flies into an unquenchable rage. And again, in the story, in The Hobbit, Tolkien says it's like certain people we know that own something for years, never even notice it, and as soon as it's taken, they fly up in a rage. Okay, so Smaug is a slave. He's a prisoner of his own vice. He's a prisoner of his own cave. But who else in the story has the dragon sickness? Anybody? There, see, this is a good audience. Yes? Thorin Oakenshield, thank you. Thorin Oakenshield obviously has the dragon sickness badly. When he gets his treasure, he forgets his love and his indebtedness to Bilbo. He becomes possessed by his possessions. But anyway, we had people shout out Bilbo. And that's the most important thing. There are others, of course. The mayor of Lake Town, of course, who runs off with the gold into the desert and dies of starvation, because as Tolkien tells us in the Hobbit, you can't eat gold. Or the Sackville Bagginses, of course. But the most important thing is Bilbo. Bilbo has the dragon sickness, and the whole point of The Hobbit, and bear in mind now Bilbo's an everyman figure, his journey is our journey, he holds up a mirror for us. The whole point of his journey is to overcome the dragon sickness. The adventure is necessary for the salvation of Bilbo's soul. Bilbo has to lose his possessions in order to gain his life. He has to lay down his life in order to live. So we see this at the end. He turns down lots of the treasure, takes a little bit of treasure, doesn't want much of it. But it's not mostly about treasure, it's about detachment. It's about not being possessed by our possessions. So what happens at the end? What's happening when Bilbo returns home? Sorry?
They're giving away all his stuff.
They're giving away all of his stuff. They're actually giving it away, they're selling it. But why are they selling it? Because they think he's dead. Okay. So I always think when Bilbo returns, I always think of Mark Twain. It's my perverse imagination. But some of you may know the story. Mark Twain is said to have read his own obituary in the newspaper. And he wrote to the editor of the newspaper to say, reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. And I can imagine that as Bilbo returns home, he can say exactly the same thing. The reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. But of course here there's a very, very important symbolism here. Because Bilbo was dead at the beginning of the story. Dead to the life of grace because of his possession, being possessed by his possessions, his dragon sickness. He dies in order not to be dead anymore. He lays down his life for his friends, which is the only real meaning of love. Lay down his life for his friends that he may live. So Bilbo's death and resurrection at the end of The Hobbit is symbolically profound and symbolizes and sums up the Catholicism of the work. It shows us the great paradoxes of the gospel, that we have to lose our life if we want to find it. We must die in order to live. We must die in order to love. Love is to sacrifice yourself for the other. Bilbo learns how to love. Bilbo learns how to live. And most importantly, for good fairy stories, and the symbolism is evident, he learns how to live happily ever after. Thank you very much.